Hello everyone. If you're wondering why my voice sounds a bit strange, it's because A, I have a cold, and B, I think my mic is acting funny. Anyway, I want you to imagine yourself on the coastline of County Cork, here in Ireland. I want you to imagine yourself in the fishing village of Baltimore, County Cork. However, I want you to imagine yourself in Baltimore not as it currently is, but as it was in the late 1620s and early 1630s. You may well ask why we're travelling back that far. And it all has to do with the actions of a Dutchman who converted to Islam after moving to the north coast of the frankly huge country of Algeria. Before you ask, yes, there actually is a link between the two, because in 1631, the man, now known as Maurice the Younger, sails out from Algiers, across the opening of the Mediterranean, past the Iberian coast, and makes landfall with his band of Barbary corsairs on the windswept shores of Ireland. Baltimore itself sits on a deep water harbour, sheltered by a string of little offshore islands and islets. Pretty much the ideal place for an Irish clan to set up a seaside stronghold. Baltimore comes from the Irish Baile Antigua Mór, town of the big house, but its older name is Dún na Shade, or Fort of the Jewels, which brings us to the rulers in charge of the village in the lead up to the, spoiler alert, Sack of Baltimore. Enter the O'Driscolls. In the 1600s, the O'Driscolls are one of the very last of the ancient Irish ruling clans, with a territory from Carbra to Bantry, including those islands we mentioned. To step out of the time machine briefly, Cape Clear, a popular holiday destination and bird observatory in the 21st century, is part of what was then territory under O'Driscoll jurisdiction. Anyway, back to the 1600s. The O'Driscolls, as with most clans, chose their area due to some resource they felt they could exploit. In their case, a small sardine-like fish called a pilchard, which was, and still is in 1631, abundant off the shores owned by the clan. In the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries, salted cured fish is not only a nice to have, but an essential staple in Ireland and, more importantly, Catholic Europe. The Church has mandated that during the entirety of Lent and on every Friday outside of Lent, no meat may be eaten, but seafood, such as pilchard, is acceptable. Side note here, that is still in place in the 21st century, but outside of Lent is strongly encouraged rather than mandated. It is still mandated on Fridays within Lent. All this means that for about a third of the year, the pilchard fishery of Baltimore is in massive demand. Essentially, the O'Driscolls controlled a 17th century equivalent of an oil field. By this time, the fishery would catch tons, literally, of pilchard every year, drag them to shore, and process them in early versions of processing plant. They were pressed for their oil using lamps and other things, and the others were packed into salt containers and sent for export to mainland Europe. We now get to the first sign that the O'Driscolls had been cozying up to the British government. In 1450, King Henry VI of England decreed that only the O'Driscoll clan and their allies could fish in O'Driscoll-controlled waters. Enter one of our protagonists, Fineen O'Driscoll, or Fineen of the Ships. He operates a system known as the Black Rent, essentially a 1600s mafia racket. It was a toll booth enforced violently. If, for example, a Spanish vessel wanted to pass through without paying the toll, they would find themselves chased, boarded, and seized in short order. The English turn a blind eye to this, since Fineen is essentially policing seas that they cannot fund policing for themselves. In 1587, he is even knighted for his services to the crown. You may wonder why his forces are so forceful. To be honest, it's probably to do with the kidnapping of his daughter, Moira, years before, by Ali Crusa. And if you're wondering, yes, he was also a Barbary corsair. It makes what happens in 1631 all the more poignant, doesn't it? Well, actually, Fineen isn't in charge of the area in 1631. Let me tell you about one of the saddest days in Irish Catholic history, the Battle of Kinsale in 1601. In short, it is a confederation of Irish Catholic chieftains versus the English, mostly Protestant, forces, who had wanted to take over their lands since the 12th century. The areas owned by the O'Driscolls were literally the last footholds that the native Irish Catholics had on the island of Ireland. But remember, Fineen had been knighted by the English, so what does a knighted clan leader do when all around him are fighting against the forces he was knighted by? He switches sides. He joins his fellow Catholics in the fight against the Crown forces. Unfortunately for Fineen, purely from a saving face point of view, this switch is disastrous. As the saying goes, a problem shared is a problem halved, and Sir Fineen had actually secured the backing, both financial and military, of the Spanish Empire. When the Spanish allies landed in a boggy, easily defensible harbour, the English under Lord Mountjoy are waiting. To relieve the Spanish, the Irish forces decide the best idea would be to attack the English under the cover of darkness. However, on that fateful night, a huge thunderstorm rolled in, and the Irish are immediately disoriented. At dawn, the English cavalry spot the would-be attackers, charge, and slaughter them. The Spanish see their help is gone and helplessly surrender. Here ends Gaelic Catholic rule in Ireland. Fineen, for his part, had to rush over to England and submit himself and his lands to the English throne in order to literally save his own head. Oh yeah, and that also means that the Black Rent is over. This creates a massive economic vacuum in West Cork. Fineen really wants to keep some semblance of control on the pilchard fisheries, and keep himself from going bankrupt, so he's forced to start parcelling out his ancestral lands for rent. Into Fineen's struggles enters a Northamptonshire Calvinist lawyer called Thomas Crook. In 1605, he leases the lands around Baltimore from Fineen. The lease is to last 21 years. Keep that very much in mind, because the negotiations for the lease take up until 1610, and that date, 21 years on from 1610, is going to be very important later. Anyway, Puritans like Crook faced heavy fines in England due to their dissent and unhappiness surrounding the practices of the Church of England. So when he leases Baltimore, Crook brings over around 200 fellow Puritans from Cornwall and the west of England to escape religious persecution. Crook straight away begins building the fishing and timber industries, so much so that in 2 years, Baltimore is officially granted market town status. Now this might not seem like much, but it allows for a weekly market and 2 fairs, which means a lot to a fishing town like Baltimore. However, rumours circulate that Baltimore is, and I quote, a nest of pirates. Not only that, but the people of Baltimore are accused of helping this piracy for personal gain. This includes Sir Thomas Crook allegedly slaughtering his own cattle to feed the pirates. At the time, the Venetian ambassador even claimed Baltimore was one of 2 chief havens for pirates in Ireland. Why? Well, just recall the geography. Perfect for sea defence meant perfect for hiding smugglers. The return? Discounted booty. Crook stands trial for piracy in 1608, but his friends in high places, in this case the Bishop of Cork, William Lyon, saves him from hanging. His defence, which is completely bought by the courts, is that Crook is responsible for the upkeep of a vital English Protestant outpost, from a defence point of view. Isn't it so hypocritical that the English version of Black Rent is endorsed by the Crown? But it isn't just the Crown that wanted a piece of the O'Driscoll lands. For our last Meet the People, may I introduce Sir Walter Coppinger. Mr. Coppinger is quite the character, to put it mildly. He's a money lender, basically a banker, a judge, and what was then known as a recusant lawyer. Essentially, recusant means he refused to attend Church of England services. Yet he continues to practice the law, which is essentially all but forbidden, but he does it anyway. This attitude gives you a kind of idea of the kind of guy he is. He is supposedly a Catholic, but, as we'll see, not a very well behaved one. His ancestors were Vikings who settled in Ireland centuries previously, so he's culturally distinct from both the Gaelic Irish and the English. He has a reputation for burying people on all sides in legal fees for very simple things, until it made him very, very rich and them very, very poor. Anyhow, I'll give you more info on him in a later episode because he is absolutely crazy. The reason I mention him at all is because of an unproven but convincing theory about the origins of the Sack of Baltimore. The English under Crook didn't actually own Baltimore. They have, as mentioned, a lease. This lease is, after some negotiations, as I mentioned, due to expire on June the 20th, 1631. So, what date do you think the Sack of Baltimore takes place, clearing the town of Baltimore of all its inhabitants? June the 20th, 1631. Coppinger wants control of the pilchard fisheries, but a court in 1630 ordered him to rent the rights to the Puritans in perpetuity, meaning for as long as they wanted. Unless, of course, the Puritans were all to suddenly vanish, not leaving any behind. To end this episode, let's move from the land to the water on that fateful date. June the 19th, 1631, the day before the attack. A fleet of North African polacca, a small, swift boat, are led swiftly and silently towards the Irish coast by Murat Rhys the Younger. Well, actually, his name was originally Jan Janzoon, and he's Dutch, not Algerian, but long before the Sack of Baltimore, he ended up in Algiers, converted to Islam, and took the name Murat Rhys the Younger. His ship itself, however, is not a polacco. Instead, it is a 300-ton captured man-of-war from the Netherlands. Murat and his 200 crewmates would wear European clothes and fly European flags. That is, until they were within reach. Then, they would swarm ships or towns in a way I'll describe in the next episode. Anyway, they do this to a fishing vessel registered, if that's the word, to Dungarvan, and it happens to be captained by an Irish Catholic by the name of John Hackett. Now, Murat Rhys doesn't know anything about Ireland, but Mr. Hackett does. So what does he do? Of course, he keeps Hackett as a hostage and a guide. Rhys demands to be led to Kinsale, but Hackett has other ideas. He knows only too well that Kinsale is one of the most well-guarded areas on the south coast and possibly all of Ireland. Also, he's a Catholic, so he's not the biggest fan of the Puritans in Baltimore. So, likely with a wink and a smile, John Hackett suggests to Murat Rhys that, instead of attacking Kinsale, the Barbary Corsairs attack the outpost of English Puritanism in Ireland, known as Baltimore. To quote him, he tells Rhys that Kinsale is too hot, because it is being guarded by a man improbably called Captain Hook, in a ship called the Fifth Lion's Whelp. He's a fisherman, likely with a cutlass to his throat, so the betrayal is understandable to one degree, but the consequences are brutal, as we shall see in a later episode. And there, a few miles off the Irish coast, is where we will leave it. Come back next week for the actual raid itself. Thanks for listening. Like this if you can, tell me what you did and didn't like, follow me on Instagram at @LeanBlakePodcaster, and, most importantly, tell everyone to listen to the History and Heritage podcast. Bye!